Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And this week, Thanksgiving week, in the U.S. anyway, we have a very special episode with a very special friend. As we mentioned in our last episode, it just felt fitting to air our conversation with podcast favorite, podcast friend, none other than mystery and thriller writer Sophie Hannah, who many of you know as the author of the Poirot continuation novels. But she also writes her own contemporary thrillers and mystery novels and has one coming out early in 2020. So we started off the conversation talking about that and then moved on to, of course, all things Agatha related. And we had so much to talk about. So let's not delay the fun any longer. We caught Sophie, of course, over the telephone. So our voices are about to go all telephonic. Let's dive right in.
We are so excited to have Sophie Hannah back on the podcast. We had an interview with her a while back discussing all things Christie, and we had so much fun that we wanted to have her back on so that we could discuss more Christie-ish things and see what she is up to at the moment. So welcome back, Sophie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Always a pleasure. So we wanted to start off, we will, of course, eventually get to Agatha Christie because we know that you have some strong opinions about the current state of our rankings, and we, of course, love nothing more than to go on and on about our rankings. It gives us an opportunity to geek out more than our once-a-year rankings-focused episode, so that's fantastic. But first, you have a new book out. And we were lucky enough to read it in advance of this conversation, and I'm happy to report that we both loved it. And I think a lot of our listeners will love it too, and certainly be interested in checking it out. So just to start off the conversation, like many a Christie title, it has a bifurcated titling here. There's a different title in the UK and the US. So for UK listeners, it is called Haven't They Grown? And in the US, it is called Perfect Little Children. Actually, I would love to just start off and hear about how the two different titles came about and who was driving that decision.
Well, so firstly, I should tell you that the only reason I ever allow my books to have two different titles is because of Agatha Christie. So, whenever it comes up, and what always happens is I choose a title, and that is then the title for the UK version of the book, and my UK publishers so far have always been happy with my titles. And then whenever it's different in the US, it's because my US publishers say, we don't think this title will work particularly well in our market, and would it be okay if we had a different title here? And I always think to myself, if it was okay from Agatha's point of view, then it's okay from my point of view. And I do get a few emails from people saying, I'm annoyed because I've now bought this book twice thinking it was a different book. So I understand that for some readers it can be inconvenient, but I like to try and let the American publishers do what they think will work best because they're the ones who have to try and sell the book in America. So I always think whenever I'm questioning, is it the right decision to agree to a title change? I always think, well, if Agatha didn't object to it, and she is the great Agatha, then, who am I to suddenly say that this isn't okay? So Haven't They Grown was, for me, the obvious title because it's what people say when they see children or teenagers that they haven't seen for a long time. They just say, wow, haven't you grown? Or haven't they grown? And it's not really a question, it's just an exclamation about, wow, the children are so much bigger. So because the book starts with Beth, the heroine, seeing her former best friend after 12 years of no contact, something has gone wrong in the friendship and the reader doesn't know what it is. All the reader knows is that after 12 years, Beth sees her ex-best friend, Flora, and Flora is with her children, and the children appear to be still 5 and 3 years old, as they were 12 years ago when Beth last saw them. She hears Flora calling them, by their names, Thomas and Emily, and she sees Thomas and Emily, and they are not only apparently still 5 and 3 years old, but they look identical to how they looked 12 years ago, and they're even wearing the same clothes that Beth remembers them wearing 12 years ago. So that's the opening mystery. And Haven't They Grown just seemed like the obvious title. Now, I was expecting my English publishers to say, no, you can't call it that. It's just too weird a title. Because I think, in this day and age, there's quite a lot of title homogeneity in the book industry. Lots of publishers say, can't you just call it The Girl on the Whatever or The Woman in the Whatever? So I was expecting some resistance, but my UK publishers were just like, that's a brilliant title. And I was like, really? I mean, yes, it is. I know.
I actually wonder what it is about us Americans that seems like the title needed to be changed that much.
As so often with these things, I think what marketing departments worry about may not always be true or valid, but in this case, I just sort of think, given that I liked Perfect Little Children as well, I didn't think it would do any harm. And I do, in some ways, I quite like having 2 different titles, because it enables me to sort of think of the book in both incarnations, and, then I can question to myself, how do I feel differently about it if I think of it as Perfect Little Children? Does it change anything about the focus or the emphasis? And in this case, I don't think it does, really. I do like both titles, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in both markets, really.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I agree with you that I think because of Agatha Christie, the tradition of having 2 titles for a book, I think there's something that's almost kind of classy about it, or nostalgic, especially within even the umbrella of mystery books. So I think it's very cool. I love that your book has 2 titles, even though I don't think it's totally necessary. So you already gave us the hook for your novel, which is great, because if you hadn't already done it, I was going to ask you to, because I think it's fantastic. And we, I believe, even in our first conversation on the podcast, discussed this a little bit, but to me, it's such an Agatha Christie hook because it's outrageous, right? You hear the book, which you just told us, and you're like, well, that's impossible. It's impossible. I have no idea how that could ever make sense. And there must be a supernatural or sci-fi explanation. That's the only way it could make sense. I don't know if this is too spoilery, but that is not the explanation. This is a very grounded book. It is not supernatural or sci-fi in nature, which is also in keeping with Christie, who tended largely not to go into those areas, especially for her novels. So to me, this is such an appropriate book to also be discussing on this podcast. I'm assuming that you did think of it that way, that this is a big book that requires...
and I can't remember whether I said this last time I was on the podcast, but one of the things I realized when I was asked to write the first of my Poirot novels was that actually all the contemporary crime novels I'd written up to that point were so heavily influenced by Agatha in that respect. I always liked to start my crime novels with a hook that is not just mysterious in an ordinary way, like Who Killed So-and-so, where the reader can imagine some possible explanations, but rather a hook that is either the apparently impossible that cannot possibly happen, and yet here it is happening. What on earth could be the explanation? And ideally, the reader can't even begin to speculate, about why that might happen. And I realized I'd been doing that ever since I started writing crime, and the reason I'd been doing it is because I'd loved Agatha Christie's way of making the mystery so much more compelling by basically putting the reader in a kind of arm lock where you just have to read on, because you cannot imagine that this could ever be made to work. And so you just have to find out what the explanation is, because you're thinking, no, I'm sorry, she can't pull this off. And so I'd always been doing that, and Haven't They Grown / Perfect Little Children is another example of that. The reason I wanted to write the novel is that when I thought of that opening mystery, I just thought, this is the best mystery ever, because it seems, on the face of it, to be unsolvable. And the challenge to me is then to solve it. And you're absolutely right, and it isn't too much of a spoiler. In a way, I sort of wish I could put this on the jacket. There is nothing supernatural about it. The explanation and everything that's going on in the book is entirely human and scientifically realistic and possible.
Yeah, Sophie, if I were your publisher, I would want to put two little strap lines in the corner saying, they're not ghosts and they're not clones.
Yeah, exactly. There's no ghostly stuff. There's no magic drug that makes people age backwards. It's all to do with human relationships and human psychology. And so in that sense, if we're talking about comparisons with Agatha, I mean, one of her books, you haven't covered it yet, but one of the books that I think she does that brilliantly in is The Pale Horse, which seems at first as though it must be supernatural, at least to an extent. And then the explanation when it comes is just brilliant, and it's not supernatural at all.
We, I think, mentioned it at the end of the last episode that the books that we still have left to cover, I think we're maybe most excited for The Pale Horse.
Yeah, I think The Pale Horse is amazing. I love that book.
I mean, I think that the interesting thing about having your book not be supernatural is that it's far scarier, the actual solution to it, than anything supernatural.
Yeah, quite often in my crime novels, whether they're Poirot or contemporary, the explanation and the murderer or the baddie or whatever is kind of a case of nobody's evil here, this is just what can happen when people get pushed to their limits. I do quite a good line in non-judgmental crime novels where there's no good versus evil, there's just, people who've messed up to a greater or lesser extent. But I think in Haven't They Grown, I've probably got my most pure, nasty, irredeemable villain character that I've ever created. There is a quite significant baddie in the book, and I don't sympathise in any way with that character. Whereas normally I do. Normally I do massively sympathise with my murderers.
I think that we would have to be a little bit concerned on this phone conversation if you sympathize with the baddie in this book.
In my mind, the evil and the harm that's being done in the book, it may be extreme, but I find it very plausible. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is to kind of show that, all the way through the book, Dominic, Beth's husband, is kind of saying, couldn't we just mind our own business? And couldn't we just get on with our nice life? And who cares if our former friends are the wrong ages? It's all very weird, but we can just stay out of this very weird scenario. And throughout the book, Beth keeps kind of questioning whether that's actually an ethical decision. And she ends up deciding that she has to go and really interfere in another family's business because she thinks something really evil and dangerous might be going on. But, that to me is not an extreme fantasy situation. That is a reality that probably all of us sometimes encounter, where you think, these are these people that I know, and yet something really bad is going on there. And then there's that resistance that we all have. There's that resistance to acknowledging that something so bad and harmful could be so close to you. And most of us just aren't willing to believe that. But I just want to put on record that I do find the badness in Haven't They Grown very plausible and realistic, and I think it absolutely could happen.
I mean, I think that all of us secretly look at various different friends and their odd relationships and wonder a little bit. And so, I mean, this is obviously the hyper-realized version of that, but I think that it does resonate in a way about our interest in other people's relationships.
Yeah, one of the things I do in all my books really is I take something that's true and I just make it slightly more extreme.
Yeah. My kind of global take on the book as a reader, just in terms of the relationships that you were exploring, was that I was really struck by the strength of the parent-child bonds that you were portraying here. But I think in general, it struck me that the spousal relationships within this book were all along the spectrum of problematic, ranging from hideously problematic to lightly problematic, which is how I would characterize, I think, Beth and Dominic's dynamic, at least as to the way he really kind of never does come around. And she really does have to rely on her daughter. as opposed to her husband to figure out what she wants to do, and she's ultimately very happy that she did do it. So I was just sort of struck by, in a book where there was a lot of bad stuff happening and a lot of problematic relationships, for the most part, the best relationships were between parents and children, and the most problematic ones between spouses. And I wonder if that's something that you thought about as you were writing it, or is that just what came about, or just how you feel about that statement?
Well, I think that's really interesting because I think that, yes, on one level it's true that Dominic doesn't encourage Beth to go and try and sort out whatever's going on with the children who haven't grown. But I didn't at all perceive Beth and Dominic's relationship as problematic, even lightly problematic. What I perceived it as was basically Dominic represents what I believe even most loving, caring, nice, good relationship spouses would do in that situation. So Dominic is in no way supposed to be a sort of suboptimal character. I believe that 99.9% of spouses, you have to imagine, Kemper, if you said to your partner, look, I spoke to Sophie Hannah today, and I have reason to believe that her children haven't aged in a decade. I think there's something weird going on, so I'm actually going to hop on a plane to England, and I'm going to interfere massively in this potentially dangerous situation. Surely your partner would say, now come on, you don't really know Sophie that well, why don't you just leave it and forget about it? So, I think 99.9% of partners would say that, and the only kind of partner who wouldn't say that is somebody like me, who just wants to get to the truth. So I'd be like, yes, let's immediately book our flights and go and interfere in someone else's business. But, I don't think it's a sign that Beth and Dominic's relationship is weak in some way, that they take different positions on it.
I actually think it's more profound what you're portraying in parent-child relationships versus spousal relationships, which is really that, a lot of times people get together in a relationship because in some ways they complement each other, right? So the idea that Beth is the kind of person who will never stop, she has this sort of dogged sense of determination and curiosity, and Dominic is very much not that person. You even talk about the fact that he never would have gotten his first job if it weren't for her, because she's applied for him, because he just never would have stuck his neck out, and he wasn't that kind of person. So they actually help each other out. So I don't mean that he's a bad character, but what I found so fascinating was the notion that because Beth and her daughter seemed to have this connection, and possibly because they're very similar, right? Because, Beth raised her, and they also are related to each other, that Xana, it feels like, was able to help her out as her child in a way and egg her on and encourage her in a way that Dominic simply wasn't able to do. And not that that shows a limitation on Dominic as a character. I think that it shows a limitation on the nature of a spousal relationship, potentially, because complementarity is not necessarily what she needed in that moment to get her to the next level. So there's this sense that I felt that Dominic was constantly holding her back. And that's not bad, and that doesn't make him a bad person. It doesn't make their relationship necessarily bad. But in the context of this book, it felt lightly problematic, or maybe just frustrating is a better way to put it. And I just found that fascinating because throughout the course of the book, we're constantly comparing this relationship to the other spousal relationship, which we won't get too specific about, but everyone should read about it because it's crazy and fascinating. It made me compare the two, which was interesting because the Beth-Dominic relationship is functional and loving, and the other relationship is so not. And I think it just sort of made me think about the nature of a spousal relationship versus one between a parent and child. And that was just really interesting to me in a book that is about such a specific, weird concept, that it had this sort of application about relationships that could be applied to anyone's relationship.
Yeah. And also I think it's probably important to point out that in any book where there's a mystery and the main character is pursuing it and desperate to know the truth, even though it's clear to the reader that the pursuit of the truth might be dangerous, it's really important to have a character in the book who is acting as the voice of restraint because it increases the pleasure for the reader. So every time Dominic says, come on now, we've done as much as we can, now we need to back off and keep out of it, the reader has a moment of increased suspense and almost fear, where the reader's then provoked into thinking, no, ignore him, find out, carry on finding out. Whereas if you just had Beth trying to find out the truth and everyone else going, come on, Beth, let's find out, there wouldn't be that resistance or the sense of a slight obstacle that the reader really wants the protagonist to basically ignore in order to give them the satisfaction of a resolution.
No, totally. But that's what's so fascinating. It's almost like this book has two antagonists, the big baddie who we won't identify, and in a weird way, Dominic, right? Because he is pulling her back constantly. And again, if the conclusion there isn't, oh, well, Dominic is a little bad and your big bad is truly bad, it's more just that, I think, the nature of a functional relationship has a little bit in common with the massively, hideously dysfunctional relationship that you are portraying. And I think that that's interesting and unsettling and just ultimately insightful as I was sitting down and thinking about the book after having finished it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I mean, it's possible that there's a part of that I am not seeing. Because, when you're the one writing the book, you don't always know what's ending up in it.
Can we ask a question about why Florida?
Yeah, no, that is a good question. Why Florida? My last standalone crime novel was, again, different title. In America, it was called Keep Her Safe, and in the UK, it was called Did You See Melody? And that was set entirely in Arizona, in a 5-star spa resort in Arizona. And I really loved writing a book that I felt was British and American, because the heroine in that novel, in Did You See Melody, is British and her family are British, but she's in America, and the crime that she is plunged into the middle of is very much an American one. And I just loved that British and American feel that I felt that book had. And it just so happened that I went to Florida, I think 4 times in about 6 months for various different book tours and festivals and events. And I love Florida. Possibly not quite as much as I love Arizona, but it's a close second.
You're just picking the locations of American retirees.
Well, it's the places that are full of beaches and swimming pools, basically. Spa resort. I'm heavily biased in favor of all those things. So I was in Delray Beach, Florida, to do an event as part of a book tour, and I just loved it. As I was there, I could see the story sort of taking shape around me, and so I thought, I'm setting some of the book here.
Yeah, and we should be clear that the book opens in England. Much of it takes place, I would say it's sort of the climactic sequence of the novel, right? In like the last quarter, would you say, of the book?
Yeah,
takes
it's
place
probably about the last quarter, yeah.
Well, and I think for American listeners, Florida is often just equated with crazy. That's a wide brush.
Oh, really?
Not totally fair.
There's for Americans, there's a meme called Florida Man. If Florida Man is whatever crazy thing happens, it actually turns out that it's because they don't privatize their arrests. So it's actually, that is part of the reason why we get so much information about crime in Florida, is because we get all of the sort of arrest reports. But yeah, Florida Man is somebody who just does something completely bonkers.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, that's quite appropriate then.
Yeah, quite appropriate in this case.
I assumed that you were aware of that. I was going to compliment you, Sophie, on your American cultural acumen, because I was like, this is a crazy climax of the novel, and there is no better place to set an insane climax such as you have than in Florida. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, no, I was unaware of all of that. Because I come to America quite often, I've been to Florida many times, and I just love it. Maybe that means I'm crazy, but I love Florida. I love Arizona. And, of course, it's because when I'm there, I spend a lot of time by swimming pools and on beaches, and that's my favorite thing. But also the people are really friendly and it's really relaxed. And, so I just wanted to put Florida in my book.
Well, appropriately so in this case.
Appropriately so. And by the way, we should extend our apologies to all Florida listeners for the wide brush with which we just painted poor Florida. But it is a fantastic climax to the book. And I think it's pretty obvious from this conversation that we both adored the novel, and we would wholeheartedly recommend to any listeners that they check it out. But we should probably transition into talking about our dear beloved Agatha Christie. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the rankings, I would just love to ask you, Sophie, I believe that you're working on a new Poirot novel. Is that correct?
Yes, that is true. I'm working on my fourth Poirot novel, which will be published next August. And this one, like all my Poirot novels, has the same title in England and America. It's called The Killings at Kingfisher Hill. I'm actually writing that at the moment, and it's coming out next August. I won't give you the blurb for it. I have got the blurb for it, but it's just as easy to read it. It's on my website. It's on Amazon's website. It's available for pre-order already.
All right.
And it's available for you to read the mysterious plot hook that is already being released.
All right. Fantastic.
In general, I think the rankings are really good. I mean, I think, given how hard it is to rank that many titles in an order that comes out feeling right, I think you've done an amazing job.
Thank you.
Well, let's start. Thank you for starting with that laudatory caveat. But I would like to hear where you think we're just completely bonkers off.
The single most off is where we should start.
Yeah, so it's not that I think anything is off. There's some things that so for example, I have always wondered whether one of the criteria that you rank on, so you've got all, the character ones and the plot ones and the stuck in its time, I wonder whether there should be one for overall enjoyableness of reading experience.
Well, we have this conversation, right? Because we talk about readability, right? And so we kind of dump that into setting and tone a lot of the time, I think.
We do. So it's our catch-all.
You might be right that there should be a separate category that is pleasurability.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I were ranking the books, I would definitely include that category because I think setting and tone is a very specific thing. It's two very specific things, and for me, it doesn't quite cover overall aceness of reading experience. And in a way, readability doesn't either, because readability is just about, in a way, how quickly and easily it goes down. Here's a good example. The Murder at the Vicarage, I would give that 9.5 out of 10 for enjoyability of reading. I had an amazing time reading that book. I loved every second of it. I don't think, in terms of the murder plot, there was something about it that slightly jarred for me and didn't quite work as well as the book overall seemed to work. But I still count The Murder at the Vicarage among my top favourites because for me, the overall enjoyability of the reading experience is the main criterion. Have you seen the movie 12 Angry Men, the Sidney Lumet 1950s movie?
Of course.
Sure.
There's a bit in that where Lee J. Cobb, who's the very angry, stubborn juror, he comes across what he thinks is a great bit of evidence and he goes,
"You can throw out all the other evidence."
And that's kind of how I feel about the overall enjoyability of the reading experience. If I have an amazing time while reading a Christie novel and I'm like, this is amazing, this is amazing, this is amazing, I'm still going to rank that Christie novel much more highly than one which works perfectly on every level but I enjoy reading less. So that is my main and big thought. And I think there's so many books it applies to. So one of my really, really favourite Agatha Christie novels is Dumb Witness. And that isn't to say that any of the flaws you identified in it weren't flaws, but I was really, really surprised by how low that ranked. Because from the minute you start reading that book till the minute you finish, I at least was just loving every second of it. And I think because of the enjoyability of reading that book, that would be quite high in my rankings.
I agree with that. I mean, I think in the case of Dumb Witness, we talked about it before, I don't think Kemper and I like reading it that much because it's repetitive. And that's what we didn't like about it. You get the same story twice. I would also point to a book that I like more than Kemper does, I think, which is Murder is Easy, which actually has something in common a little bit with Dumb Witness. I quite like Murder is Easy.
Yeah, Murder is Easy is a tricky one because for me, one of the things that contributes to overall enjoyable reading experience is I have to not know what the solution's going to be. And with Dumb Witness, I couldn't see where it was going, so I was properly in suspense. With Murder is Easy, I thought that had an amazing opening hook with the old lady on the train, and then she gets... I mean, that was just brilliant. Yeah. And what detracted from my enjoyable reading experience was that at a certain point, and way too early, it became very obvious to me who the murderer was. I mean, it was it was one of the few cases where I was like, that's obviously the murderer, and then it was. So for me, that wouldn't be high up in the enjoyability stakes. But I'll tell you another one that would. Murder in Mesopotamia. It's interesting that the notion of, like, plausibility, because there are some episodes where you say that something isn't entirely credible, and I know what you mean because it's kind of very out there, but I am happy to find plausible anything that I believe could happen, even if it's not likely to. So like in A Murder is Announced, the one I've just listened to this morning, the idea that if you wanted to kill that one dude who works in the hotel, that the way to do it that springs to mind would be get him to announce the murder and that, you know, all of that. I can see how that is really weird as a plan, but I wouldn't define that as not credible because human beings regularly make things more complicated and more ridiculous than they need to be.
So right, I would point you back to Florida Man, Sophie.
Well, exactly, but I have to say I think everything in Haven't They Grown is plausible. Just because most people don't behave in that way, you only need to believe that one person is screwed up enough or overcomplicating enough to do things in a crazy, messed up way in order for that to be plausible. So I find things credible much more often than other people do, because I think if one human being is weird enough to do it, then it's plausible. But one rare thing in Christie that I did find implausible was the idea that in Murder in Mesopotamia, that she wouldn't recognise that her second husband was in fact her first husband. Right? I was just like, no, in no way is that possible. But because the reading experience was so amazing, I would give much greater a weighting to how much I enjoyed reading that book, even with that big flaw. Whereas a book like, for example, Cards on the Table, which probably doesn't have any serious flaws and is very high in the ranking, I don't know why, but I just didn't enjoy reading that book very much.
A lot of people don't like that book very much, as it turns out. We have found that from comments, and it's interesting. I think it's problematic in a bunch of ways, problematic in the modern parlance. But I don't know, I liked reading Cards on the Table, but a lot of people seem not to.
Yeah, no, I don't know. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy it. I basically enjoy reading all of Agatha's books, but it wasn't one that I enjoyed massively. And so if I were to do my personal rankings, I would probably actually have overall enjoyability of the reading experience as maybe double the amount of points. So if I gave something 8 for overall enjoyability, I would then double that and make that 16, because for me that is just the overwhelmingly main criterion.
It's a valid argument. Actually, you know, I would also say that Murder at the Vicarage is in the top 10 as we have it, and I don't know that it's necessarily that good of a book, but we have it there because we love it.
I think you're right. I think that perhaps having another category about enjoyability would be appropriate, but I think that what we've done is that where we have the sense that, hey, this is a book that was just super enjoyable and just amazing to read, it gooses up the rankings in other categories because of that. And perhaps because we're also trying to tie it to, well, what specifically did make it enjoyable and super fun to read. And I think that even though, these categories can be a little bit imprecise, especially that setting/tone category, which really has become a bit of a catch-all, The Murder at the Vicarage, I agree, we have it in our top 10. And I think the only reason that it is in our top 10 is because we both enjoyed reading it so much.
Yeah, I think that's really likely, actually, that sense of overall enjoyability comes through in your other rankings that you give. I think that must be true, otherwise I wouldn't agree with the rankings as much as I do.
It's interesting that the titles that you identified as, having super high enjoyability within our rankings, the one where I completely agree with you, which is Murder at the Vicarage, we have in our top 10, and I think it's because of that exact reason. And then for whatever reason, just because people have different reading experiences, we both just didn't respond the same way to Dumb Witness. And we obviously liked or enjoyed reading Cards on the Table more than you did. And I totally agree. I mean, that one is just, for whatever reason, one of Christie's most divisive books. And there are some people that just don't enjoy reading it, and then there are others that really do. And we just happen to be two people who
even just looking at this, I think that both Kemper and I would agree that if we were just ranking this based on what we liked, Sad Cypress would be way higher.
See, Sad Cypress is one that I liked but didn't. I really liked it, but it wouldn't be in my favourite. And obviously, personal taste is so significant here. People are going to have different favourites. So it's interesting that there's so much that I do agree with. I'll tell you another one that really baffles me. I can't believe that you've put Death Comes as the End so low down, because I loved that book. For me, that was a really enjoyable reading experience, and I don't think that book really puts a foot wrong in the sense that you are in suspense and really wanting to find out all the way through, and then the solution is plausible and satisfying, and there's that brilliant moment where you suddenly realize that the detail about her looking back down the slope and her husband is there, but you just don't realize she's looking at him. And then when you find out, it's like, oh yeah, that clue was so obvious, and yet I didn't get it. And I finished that book and thought, there are no flaws in this book, which I don't always think at the end of a Christie. So I was really surprised that was like even lower than The Mystery of the Blue Train, which for me would be at the bottom. So for me, The Mystery of the Blue Train is right at the bottom of my rankings.
For Agatha, it would be at the very bottom, right? I mean, isn't that her least favorite book?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's my least favorite of her books. I found that book a real struggle. So, for that to be above Death Comes as the End, which I just loved, I found really weird. I'm not pressuring you to change it. I just wanted to register my surprise.
I still have, it's a running joke a little bit that I think maybe The Secret of Chimneys is not as bad as we think it is.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put The Secret of Chimneys in my top 30, but I enjoyed it more than The Mystery of the Blue Train.
Right.
But there's very few books that I think are way lower than they should be, but I do think Death Comes as the End is one of them. I found that to be a satisfying mystery and solution combination, and I was on the edge of my seat in suspense throughout.
It's so interesting because I was as inside my seat as I could possibly be. I was curled up in it and falling asleep as I reread that. For whatever reason, here's the thing, if it weren't for this podcast, if I had picked that book up to reread it, I never would have finished it. I don't know why.
Really?
I was actually shocked because I know that I read it before, of course, and I have no memory of disliking it. So I figured, this is the historical one. This is a cool new genre. I can't wait to go to ancient Egypt. And I was just floored by how bored I was. But you're not wrong. I agree. The simplicity of that clue, she's just looking at her husband, is brilliant.
Yeah.
And there is nothing wrong with it. I would say that it has no flaws, but for me, it doesn't have much to recommend it. And absence of flaws is not necessarily enough for a book to sparkle.
I think maybe it goes back. It might go back to that enjoyability argument or readability argument, and that might be what it is.
Yeah, I think that's true, because there's plenty of books that if they have no flaws, I still wouldn't love them if the reading experience wasn't huge fun. So, I totally understand that. I think it's really interesting because right from the start that book gripped me. I think Renisend is a really good character. I think there's a real sort of elegant simplicity to that book. I love the body lotion that's got poison in it. I don't know.
That is cool. I'm excited for the adaptation. I'm thrilled that there is going to be an adaptation for that book.
So then the other one that I wanted to just register a query about, you're going to be shocked by this. Prepare to be shocked.
Okay.
For me, Five Little Pigs would not be number one.
I was waiting for this, Sophie.
I think it's a brilliant book. I loved it. I found the reading experience to be really enjoyable. But because it's number one, and so it's up there with all the big guns, I feel that I have to say, and I reread it recently, and I knew it was John Curran's favourite, so I just assumed I'd agree, because I always agree with John Curran. He's like the world's leading authority.
He's brilliant. He's so brilliant,
There's something, he's amazing, so I hope he's still my friend after he hears me say this. So I do think Five Little Pigs is brilliant, but for me, it has a bit of a significant flaw, which is there's a slightly unoxygenated quality to it. It's got that structure of the five people all say their first bit, then the five people all say their second bit, and then is there a third bit? I can't remember if they only go around twice or if they go around 3 times. But that structure of first the five tell you this, then the five tell you that, it felt slightly confined and constrained and kind of airless.
Kemper, he had exactly the same opinion as you did. And then when we came around to the novel episode, Kemper changed his tune.
And this is actually really interesting because John Curran himself, I remember in our conversation with him, he also, and I remember him joking that he felt like he was in a 12-step program or something, talking about Five Little Pigs, because we were all talking, or at least the two of us, John and I, were talking about, yes, we finally came around and saw the light about Five Little Pigs, because I initially felt exactly as you feel about it, that it's constrictive, there's something airless about it, the repetition. I would imagine you feel similarly, that you get why the repetition is happening. It's purposeful on Christie's part. It's not like you think she doesn't know what she's doing with the repetition, but that you just don't enjoy it, per se.
Yeah, structurally, I think it works really well. I think there's lots of amazing elements to it. So I love the clue about the packing. I'll send her packing and I'll see to her packing. I mean, that's a genuinely brilliant clue. And all of that is brilliant and flawless. But in my favourite Christie novels, there's a kind of sense of what a great literary novelist she is as well. There's kind of an expansive sense of all of human life is here, the humour and the absurdity and the tragedy and the evil and the good, almost in a way a bit like Dickens. There's the plot and the plot mechanics, and then there's just this sense of a wide world and human life going on and the texture. And so Five Little Pigs felt almost a bit like a very constrained exercise. It was almost like an Agatha Christie novel locked in a box. That's the closest I can come to describing how I felt.
I would say, because clearly I am the person who is forcing this argument, I would say that I think Five Little Pigs is devastating. I think that it's not locked in a box. I think that every single person is traumatized by what happened that day, and that the repetition is actually a symptom of the damage done to them. And I think it's as literary as she gets, because what's happening in Five Little Pigs is trauma pulled from the past that Poirot has to seek out, and he has to release it again. And that is what the repetition is for.
I agree with all of that, and I think that totally works. And again, it's probably just a personal taste thing, which is why, I would absolutely agree that Five Little Pigs is flawless and brilliantly done, and definitely one of her best novels. But for me, it probably wouldn't be, in fact, it definitely wouldn't be top 10, and that is purely, again, down to enjoyability of reading experience. And I find it quite interesting to compare it in particular to one of the Poirot novels that would be in my top 10, which is Evil Under the Sun, which I think has an amazing plot. The whole thing about Arlena Stewart being initially presented as the evil temptress, and then it turns out that she's the victim, and everyone's been projecting their ideas about beautiful women onto her, including the reader. I mean, I think the plot is flawlessly done and really ingenious in that book, and there's also just that brilliant sense of the resort and all the life that's going on around. So for me, Evil Under the Sun is a far, far better novel than Five Little Pigs, or at least a more enjoyable one. In my rankings, it would be higher.
I would say this about Five Little Pigs. It's funny, I agree with everything Catherine is saying, because I really did come around to adoring that book for all of the reasons that she was saying. I don't disagree with what you were saying either, Sophie, and maybe this helps clarify my feelings on it, especially when you were just talking about Evil Under the Sun. I think often in Christie, when we read the most Christie-ish Christies, you're tripping along the pages and she's taking you through these gonzo plots so quickly and so easily that you often don't realize how profound the book is until you sit down and think about it after you've finished, because you've gulped it down.
Yeah.
Because how could you not gulp it down? Because it's delicious, right? You have to,
exactly,
and that's part of her power. Like, that is quintessential Christie. Five Little Pigs, I think, is the rare Christie that is not gulpable. And I would agree with Catherine that I actually think it is her most literary, and in a way that potentially is a criticism, because it's the one that is a little harder to read, or you have to take a little bit more time with it, or you can at least get a sense of what she's trying to do and the profound sort of commentary that she's trying to make while you're reading, which is what so many quote-unquote literary authors do. And with Christie, you usually have to do that after the fact, when you're sitting down and thinking more deeply about it, which many people don't do, which is often also why there are so many misunderstandings about Christie. But I think it kind of just depends then on what your stance is as to, do I love that most Christie-ish of Christie reading experiences where I gulp it and then I sit and think about it, or do I actually appreciate that this is one book where she showed us her literary skill in the actual reading of the book? And I would argue that I think Catherine and me, as I read it again and thought more deeply about it, I actually really appreciated that, because I think it's the book that, more than any other, if someone came up to me and said Agatha Christie isn't a good writer, I would say, read Five Little Pigs and you're wrong.
Yeah. I mean, for sure.
Yeah, I can see, and I can absolutely see that. If somebody, like if you wanted to make a case for her as a serious writer about psychological trauma and human relationships, I might well recommend it too. This actually might come into why I'm not so keen on Cards on the Table as well, because that has a kind of constrained element to it, doesn't it, with the bridge game.
Oh, yeah.
And so maybe I just don't like that sense of constraint. On the other hand, when it's done in Murder on the Orient Express, I absolutely love it. You know, the way that middle section, having been quite expansive at the beginning, it then goes to that very constrained and repetitive middle section where one person after another is interviewed. That, I think, works brilliantly, and I can't get enough of it. So, a lot of this is just down to personal taste. But if I was nominating best Poirot novels, which I often am, because people always want to know what my favourite is, and I don't have just one favourite, but I wouldn't include Five Little Pigs. I would include Orient Express, Evil Under the Sun, The Hollow. I was really glad you rated The Hollow highly, because I love that book. And I would also include one that you've got coming up. You were talking in the Murder is Announced episode about the books that you've still got to come, which are top-notch. And I think one that is definitely top-notch is After the Funeral. I think that is an amazing Poirot novel. Until I read The Hollow, or rather until I reread The Hollow, After the Funeral was my favourite one.
Just one last comment, because I'm fascinated by what came up with Five Little Pigs versus Evil Under the Sun. There is a persuasive argument to be made, though, that if someone is saying, oh, I don't think Agatha Christie is a good writer, it's actually in a way almost not fair to the overall to say read Five Little Pigs, because that is one of the books where she's doing something so different. The best answer is read something like Evil Under the Sun, give it its due and think about it, and you'll realize how brilliant it is. You know what I mean? It's almost like she's playing by everyone else's rules with a book like Five Little Pigs, being a quote-unquote serious writer, but one can judge her as a serious writer on all of her titles. You know, I don't disagree with anything that you're saying, Sophie, even though I don't think that we should knock it out of first place. Don't worry, Catherine. Catherine is shaking in fear right now.
I know. I'm totally, like, I'm traumatized.
No, I wouldn't want you, honestly, I wouldn't want you to change anything because of me. I'd feel really guilty.
I'll have to talk to my therapist about my trauma. But, you know, I will say Five Little Pigs is number one, but it's not the only number one, right? So it's co-listed with And Then There Were None, which you've not mentioned, Sophie. And so I think that And Then There Were None is actually Christie doing Christie. If Five Little Pigs is literary, then And Then There Were None is Christie at Christie's puzzle best.
Yeah, except that And Then There Were None it is undoubtedly brilliant, but it's not typical of Christie in terms of its tone. It is one of her few, but in fact it may even be the only one of her novels that is really properly and wholly dark and sinister, with there's no light in
relief. It. No, there's no light in it at all.
Yeah, that's true.
So I would absolutely recommend it, but I wouldn't give it to someone as typical. If someone says to me, which again happens often, I've never read Agatha Christie, which one should I read? I will typically recommend things like Evil Under the Sun, 3-act tragedy, Murder on the Orient Express. I often recommend people start with The Body in the Library, which I adore, even though I totally get, you know, once I listened to your episode on it and you pointed out that the characters were not quite as good as they are in some of the other books, so you don't really sort of care and invest in that same way. I did agree with that, but I love that book, and I think on a plot level and on a mystery and solution level, that book is absolutely flawless. So I often recommend that as a good first Agatha book to try.
Speaking of Miss Marple, I would probably recommend Murder at the Vicarage.
There is a bit of a niggle for me with Murder at the Vicarage, because I would worry that if I recommended that I'd be recommending someone start with a book where actually I don't think the murder plot works particularly brilliantly. So I would always want someone to start with an example where Agatha was being really ingenious. And I think Evil Under the Sun, there is so much ingenuity in that book. There's the timing of the murder, there's the misleading about Arlena, there's the couple who seem not to be getting on, but actually they're conspiring. There's the brilliant detail about the bath, where somebody says, what's the significance of somebody having a bath? And Poirot says, exactly, it's a completely ordinary event, and that's why it's significant. I mean, there's just so many little brilliant details. And then there's the setting, which I just think is amazing, with that American couple and all the other tourists. And so I think I might recommend that as a first Christie to a newcomer.
So many of our top 10s, interestingly, are not those typical Christies that you're talking about. That I think would be the best answer if someone were asking, what Christie should I read if I haven't read Christie before? But for my money, within that top 10, I would say Death on the Nile, because I think Death on the Nile is another one that is her, puzzle mystery is airtight. You know, she's in tip-top form on all counts.
Yeah, no, I love that book. That's one of my favorites. The only flaw that book has for me is that there's an element of jewel theft. And I really don't like it when Agatha starts writing about jewel thieves. I'm not interested in jewels or the thieving of them.
But she loves that. All the short stories, you know, we cover so many short stories on the podcast, and so many of them are about jewel theft. And I really have to wonder, how many jewels can be thieved? You know, like...
No, that's I've got a red line when it comes to jewel theft. But like, not all, you know, even And Then There Were None, which is so brilliant, I think it has a significant flaw, and no one has noticed this apart from me. But because the plot is so tight and everything makes sense, and it's one of those novels where the structure of everything is so clear and brilliant. The little imperfection bothers me, and the little imperfection is that one of the people who's murdered, I don't think is in the same category as the others. The old woman who fires a maid because she gets pregnant out of wedlock, I don't think she is in the same category of death-causing and moral responsibility as all the other people who get effectively executed on the island. That really bothers me because, although by firing that maid she's clearly being uncompassionate and her values are a bit out of whack, it is within anyone's rights to fire a member of staff if they don't share your values to a certain extent. If that was her morality, and it was very common in those days for people to think that sex and having babies out of wedlock was wrong, then it's not unreasonable of her. I mean, we might think it is, but for her to say, okay, I don't want to employ you anymore, it may be harsh and cruel and wrong in one way, but it doesn't cause the death of that person. So it always bothered me a little bit that was presented as being morally on a par with the other death causes.
Interesting. I think it's an arguable point.
Emily Brent, right, who's the one who,
I think everyone else either causes a death deliberately or behaves in a way that is sure to cause a death, so you really get a sense that they are to blame for the death, whereas in the case of Emily, she fires somebody, and she doesn't really have any way of predicting that will end in death. That's the key. I think there's a much closer link between the act committed by the person and the death or deaths of other people in all the other cases. I think in Emily's case, for all she knew, that girl could have got a job somewhere else, or she could have gone and stayed with her Aunt Maureen, or, it wasn't like a certain death scenario.
Have you ever watched the play An Inspector Calls, J.B. Priestley play?
Yes. Not only have I watched it, but I know it very well because my daughter last year and my son this year are studying it for their exams. So I'm very well acquainted with it.
So I think Emily Brent, she could be one of the characters within An Inspector Calls, because the point that he seems to be making in that play is that all these people, in their additive way, by the things that they do to this woman, right, who ultimately commits suicide, they drive her to the point of desperation, right, to the point where she, in fact, kills herself, and they are, as a whole, morally responsible for her death. They essentially murdered her, even though each of them did not do anything that on its own necessarily would have brought that about, and they certainly did not intend to kill her, but their actions certainly leave a lot to be desired, which would be putting it lightly. And obviously, play about classism, etc. But I would argue Christie's just making the same point. She's just doing it much more forcefully and perhaps not as convincingly for you with Emily Brent. But it's the same idea, right? That she's bringing about the death, and by her lack of care and her kind of neglectful attitude toward this defenseless woman, she is such a cause of the suicide that results, that she is in fact morally culpable.
I mean, I think in An Inspector Calls, it works brilliantly because there's total consistency. So all those members of that family all did exactly the same thing. They all acted in a callous and selfish way, and the result of their behavior was that the woman was so desperate that she killed herself. So there's nowhere in that play where you go, well, hang on, the dad did something really bad, whereas the son did something not, they've all done the same thing in relation to the woman who killed herself. So we as the audience are able to say, yeah, they all treated that woman wrongly. So there's no jarring thing. I think the reason for me this stands out as a little imperfection in And Then There Were None is that there isn't that equivalency. Mm-hmm. So, if the judge had set out to punish a load of people who'd done very heartless things, then there would be consistency. And I think for me, it's just because in all of the other cases, I think without exception, there's a direct link. What they've done is something unquestionably evil.
Right. I mean, I would argue, I think that the gray zone of her culpability is interesting and calls into question the murderer's thought process.
Yeah, he's a psychopath. Like, let's be clear. He is a psychopath who invites a bunch of people who were not punished for essentially, in a lot of cases, somewhat passive crimes.
That is a good defense. So the guy who's arranging all this is a complete psychopath. So if he's particularly harsh on one character, it's plausible that he's harsh because he is in fact a mass murderer. So he's not exactly. Anyway, so that must, I think you've just solved my quibble on that point. And to be honest, it's a really minor quibble.
She's setting up a gray zone, I think, in terms of, do these people deserve what they get? And obviously no one deserves to get murdered, so the answer is no. But it's an open question in the book because these people are also horrible. So if the answer for one or more of them is no, as a reader, I think it's more just interesting. I don't think it's not like the house of cards of the novel falls apart because of that. I think it would be more problematic, obviously, say if Emily Brent were the last one to be killed, because even though it's not exact, there is this sort of sense at one point, or I feel like maybe it's almost like an apocryphal thing that people say, and maybe it's super textual, that the order of the murders is somewhat in increasing moral culpability. That, too, is very arguable, though, because the first guy who gets killed ran over 2 kids with his car. So
Anthony directly murdered 2 children.
Actually, I remember about a year or maybe longer ago, there was a discussion on Twitter. We Christie obsessors were ranking in order of moral culpability all the characters, and I think I probably got into my Emily Brent criticism there as well. But it was fascinating because when we started doing this on Twitter, obviously everyone ranked them differently. So it would probably there'd probably be a lot of disagreement if you tried to get any consensus on most to least culpable rankings.
Right.
Did you ask me before whether I had a favourite Miss Marple?
I was literally about to repeat that question, Sophie, because we cannot let you go without asking that question.
You're gonna be very disapproving. I absolutely agree that A Murder is Announced is the best Miss Marple, and I haven't reread it recently, but I thoroughly enjoyed it when I did read it. But I think my favourite Miss Marple is The Body in the Library. There's just something about the lightness of touch and the brilliant opening. I don't know. It could be also sentimental because it was the first one I read. And I think A Murder is Announced, although it's absolutely brilliant, there's an element of it where, you know, when lamps are falling over and cables are burning and European cooks are having a tantrum, it goes slightly towards, this is all a bit absurd. I mean, it doesn't get there, and it's unquestionably the best and most impressive, but I reread The Body in the Library on holiday a couple of years ago, and I just loved it. So for me, that was a 10 out of 10 enjoyability of reading experience. So I would say The Body in the Library is my favourite Miss Marple.
I completely understand that, and I have a brand new insight into The Body in the Library based on the last Christie that I just read for an upcoming episode. I literally just finished it last night. We've covered thus far only one of those novella-length stories that she did in Murder in the Muse. We covered Triangle Roads a while ago, but we're going to cover Murder in the Muse in the coming weeks/months. Not exactly sure what the posting schedule of that is. So I just finished it, and what I was really struck by is that, and I think Christie herself even said this at one point, if she could just write her mysteries the way she'd like to write them, they would be about 40,000 words. They would really be novellas, and she wouldn't have to pad them out with the extra stuff that she often felt that she had to pad them out with. And I think she does better or worse on that padding out, depending on the title. Sometimes the padding out is the best part of the novel, or it's one of the really enjoyable parts of the novel. Sometimes it feels like padding and it's not great. And I think that The Body in the Library at 200 pages is her most novella-like novel. And it has that kind of sparse, precise puzzle mystery machine quality to it, which is like one of the best Christie delights. And I was just struck by how enjoyable that is after I read Murder in the Mews, because it has a very simple idea, but a very clever idea. She lays it out with a small cast of characters. We follow Poirot and Japp through the mystery, and we're done. And it takes 80 pages, and it's over. There's no couples in love. There's no jewel theft. It's all over, and it's so satisfying. And I think she managed to capture that in The Body in the Library in one of her shortest novel forms in a way that a lot of the other Miss Marples feel very stuffed. And she even called out in her autobiography, The Murder at the Vicarage, for being stuffed to bursting with incident and side plot. And I think, say what you will about A Murder is Announced, we even mentioned that that is the case in that novel. And The Moving Finger, too, has a lot going on, and we haven't covered the others, but I suspect that Body in the Library is her most delightfully spare. So I totally get identifying that as your favorite Miss Marple.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad you don't disapprove too much. I'll tell you what, if you're doing Murder in the Mews, I would love it if you did an episode on Dead Man's Mirror.
Oh, we will.
Because that's really interesting. Yeah, oh, good.
We're covering everything, Sophie. Don't you worry. Every single title.
I know, it's brilliant. I love it. Honestly, it's my favourite podcast. When a new episode lands, I'm just so excited, especially if it's one about one of the novels.
Well, maybe we should just end on that.
Yes, that's a good note to end on. Well, it's been really lovely to chat to you both, and happy to look forward to Evil Under the Sun replacing Five Little Pigs at the top of the chart.
Oh my gosh, I'm just going to go bash my head against the wall. You know, you're going to be Emily Brent, actually, Sophie, because when I go jump off of something, it's going to turn out
it's going to be my fault.
Yeah, it's Sophie is culpable.
I retract that statement entirely in that case.
Seriously, thank you so much, Sophie, for talking with us again. We always have so much fun talking with you. I hope this won't be our last chat for the podcast.
I know, yeah. I'll come back for some late period Christie discussion, maybe next year.
Oh, I can't wait.
We'll have a long conversation about the Pale Horse.
Yeah, and I'm dying to see what you think of After the Funeral as well. Great to chat to you both. Bye. Bye.
Well, that was a fantastic conversation, as we knew it was going to be. We always love having Sophie on. Incidentally, it was almost a year to the day that we had our first Sophie Hannah conversation. So again, there's just something about the joy and togetherness and warmth of the Thanksgiving holiday that makes us want to talk to Sophie and share those conversations with all of you. If you are in the U.S., have a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. If you are not in the U.S., have a wonderful day. We should note that our next episode will also be a special episode, just all sorts of special episodes bubbling about this time of year, which feels appropriate. We are about to watch Knives Out, as I suspect many of you are, the Rian Johnson vehicle showcasing his love of Agatha Christie and the whodunit genre. So we have very high hopes for that. And we'll be posting a short episode reacting to that film once we've watched it. And we should note that our next novel episode, yes, it's been a while since we've had one, but it is coming, we promise, will be They Came to Baghdad, that Christie mid-career thriller. Bit of an outlier in the but we will have many thoughts. If you have any comments, we would love to hear them, as we always do. First off, you can interact with us on our Patreon site over at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. And you can find us on email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. We are on Twitter at allaboutthedame. Catherine is on Twitter at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and our Instagram handle is at All About Agatha. And so many of you have been leaving us ratings and reviews. We would love it if more of you did so as well. It really, really helps us out. So thank you to everyone who has done that thus far. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.